Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
They tried to make me go to rehab. I said no, no, no. Yes, I've been black, but when I come back, no, no, no. I ain't got the time, and if my daddy thinks I'm fine, they try to make me go to rehab.
The great Amy Winehouse, one of the great talents of the last 40 years, who unfortunately was taken far too early. And here she is singing about rehab, which is the ultimate irony because she struggled with addiction and alcoholism herself. And ultimately that proved to be her undoing. And for years, I have heard the description of addiction as being a disease. And this actually came up in my brain yesterday when President Trump was talking about declaring the drug cartels terrorist actors or whatever he was going to declare them. Because I was saying to myself, as President Trump was saying that, until the demand for drugs in this country is reduced, I'm not necessarily sure what making them terrorist actors is going to do. Because if people still really want to get drugs, they're going to find a way to get drugs, whether they're from Mexico or China or Afghanistan or anywhere else or in their backyard. So constantly hearing that description of addiction as a disease, this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago really caught my attention. Headline, "People say addiction is a disease. Mine wasn't." It was written by Owen Flanagan, who's a professor of philosophy and neurobiology emeritus at Duke University. He's also the author of the new book, What Is It Like to Be an Addict? He's kind enough to join us now from Europe. Professor Flanagan, it's great to talk to you.
Same here, Frank. Thank you very much for having me.
Sure thing. Your essay begins, and I'm going to link to it on my Facebook page if people want to read it, facebook.com/MoranoFan. Your essay begins with a raw and vivid description of your addiction. What was it like revisiting those memories to write about them, and how has your perspective on those years evolved over time?
Yeah, that's great, Frank. So, yeah, I was... It's hard, of course, to tell a sort of unattractive story about oneself in public. But I decided that because of my experience having been an addict, but also as something of an expert on, ideas about ethics and responsibility because I do philosophy, and also because of my work in neurobiology, I felt like I had something to say from the inside about what what the experience is like to an addict. And of course, there's not one experience. Mine was I was addicted to alcohol and benzodiazepine, whereas other people are addicted, of course, to opiates and cocaine and so on and so forth. But I thought that it would be useful to share my perspective on what kind of thing addiction was. And I have noticed over the years that in meetings at AA and NA, when people talk about their addictions, if they ever talk about it as a disease, which is not that common, they tend to talk about it as a disorder or something like that, or a psychiatric or mental disorder. But the only disease they ever compare it to is type 2 diabetes, which is interesting because that's an unusual kind of disease itself, where the person who develops type 2 diabetes has to do a bunch of things to create the conditions for that diabetes to develop. For example, bad eating habits, obesity, and so on. And then once they know they have that problem, whether we call it a disease or a disorder, they have to do things about it. They have to take responsibility. And what I was worried about was the fact that people so glibly go from the idea that, as soon as we declare that addiction is a disease, that removes the burden of responsibility from the addicts themselves because they have a disease, and we should not make them feel ashamed or guilty. Somehow we should just remove the stigma and go on. So that was how I got into this way of thinking, and it just became clear to me from studying the neuroscience of it that despite the fact that everybody says in neuroscience that, addiction is a brain disease, not one element of any disease in the brain has been identified for any addiction whatsoever. So it seemed to me to be time to restore the idea that addiction is a largely disordered relation to a substance. I mean, I'm only talking about substance addictions myself because I don't know enough about gambling and things like that, although I'm very interested in those. But that we need to restore the perspective of addicts, which is usually that it's serving some deep psychological purpose for them to use their drug of choice. And eventually it doesn't work to produce the effect that it initially produced. That's when you have a problem. And of course, there are some brain aspects that underlie it, because clearly there are problems that addicts have with increased tolerance, with withdrawal, with craving, and so on. But to leverage your way out, you don't treat the brain ever. You treat things like cognition. You try to get people to break the behavioral habit. Behaviors aren't in the brain. So I'm not the only one to have thought this way. I feel like many people pick up on the idea that addictions really are complicated psychological, biological, social, behavioral disorders. And that's sort of the basic idea, Frank, yeah.
At 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Owen Flanagan. Professor Flanagan, I want to come back to the disease versus disorder aspect of your essay and your book in a moment. But I'm so curious about your personal experience and your personal perspective. You mentioned that addiction consumed your entire being in ways that diseases usually don't. How do you think this insight shapes the way that addiction should be treated?
Good. So one of the things that I emphasize in the book was that, just as you said, it's sort of existentially absorbing. I mean, for almost any addict, you have to spend an awful lot of time developing the habit. Not an awful lot of time, actually. It can be fairly short. But even things like heroin, you only get about a 30% at most addiction rate for people who use it. It's usually between about 10 and 30% for any really even addictive drug. So what does it take to become an addict? Well, you have to sort of have a community in which it's available. You mentioned in the beginning, what drugs are available. It just depends. And kids are exposed to, as it were, whatever drugs are available in the local environment, even before we adults, know what's available to them. They often are encouraged by cool kids to take whatever the drugs are that are the ones available. So they're part of a lifestyle. They're sometimes socially encouraged, and they can become part of an identity. I talk in the book, and I think in the Wall Street Journal article, I grew up in a family where we did not approve of alcoholism, which I eventually succeeded at, but we did think of ourselves as drinkers. And drinking was part of every social ritual. It was part of, wonderful holidays with family. There was cocktail hour. So there was a lot of social encouragement, and my identity tied up with being a certain kind of person. Possibly, by the end, I kept hoping I'm a high-functioning alcoholic. But I had to deal with the fact at the end that I had been a drinker, an alcoholic for so long, and a drug abuser, that I wasn't sure who I was without that, despite the fact that it had caused terrible, terrible consequences. And one hears that very often from addicts that whatever they're suffering from, it's a very holistic kind of set of phenomena. Sometimes it's people who use drugs my first use of drugs actually was in New York. During years, I used to listen to Cousin Brucey on your station.
Outstanding. Well, not that you were on drugs, but that you were listening to Cousin Brucey.
Right. But I took my first drink at a friend's in Hartsdale, New York, nearby you. And I remember walking back after that, as a 13-year-old boy, having taken the first sip of hard apple cider. And suddenly I felt safe in the world. I would never have said I didn't feel safe before that, but I remember distinctively thinking, wow, I just feel different. And, that's one way to sort of your personality to be absorbed into your identity, into your addiction. Mm-hmm. Other people use because it's damn fun. And that's something that anti-drug people just don't emphasize enough. There's many, many responsible uses of every kind of drug. Most of them are performance enhancing. At low levels, including, cocaine, nicotine, methamphetamine. You do
caffeine.
Better in school.
Yeah.
Caffeine. Certainly, all these.
Adderall, sure.
Adderall. I said to a student recently, I said, now go finish your paper. He said, I will now go do that. I'll go home and I'll take an Adderall. I said, what does Adderall feel like? He said, 25 IQ points. And supposing that's even true, but if you think about it, there's huge benefits to sort of helping you be the person you are that very often we addicts have sort of initially latched onto wanting to use drugs related for lifestyle reasons because our friends do it. I went to college in the late 60s. Marijuana was just part of who we were, it was part of the ways we listened to music. It was the part of the way we thought of dating and mating. It was included in all the important rituals of life, baptisms, confirmation, bar mitzvahs, weddings. So these are very, very holistic, and somewhat unique, the profiles of people who get into addiction.
If you're just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. We're talking with Owen Flanagan. If you want to check out his book, it is absolutely worth checking out. It's called What Is It Like to Be an Addict? I published an excerpt, or I posted an excerpt of it on my Facebook page that was in the Wall Street Journal, facebook.com/Morano fan. You challenge, as you alluded to a couple of minutes ago, the brain disease model of addiction. Why do you think this framework has persisted despite its limitations and, as you seem to mention, the lack of evidence? What are the risks of framing addiction in the way that it has been framed as a disease?
Good. So, as I said, one of the reasons to just resist it is that usually, take something like type 1 diabetes. Well, that's a disease because it has to do with one organ, in that case, the pancreas, releasing insulin and certain cells that are known to be deficient. In the case of addiction, some people held out the hope that they would figure out, and you hear dopamine. Dopamine is one neurotransmitter. But now all the evidence is that there are at least 18 different brain areas and probably 100 neurotransmitters involved in even the physiological basis of addiction. But nonetheless, this particular doctrine has survived. Now, anything that's holistic is just not usually identified. At least it's certainly not one brain disease. Now, what's the problem with it? Here's one of the problems. For example, about 50 addiction rates run about this way. In any given year, 16.5% of Americans would be scientifically thought to be suffering from some kind of substance use disorder. That's a lot, right? About 60 or 70% of them would be alcohol. Somewhere between 20, 40% would be other substances. Now, those other substances, many of the people who are addicted have co-occurring psychiatric disorders. And the reason that is relevant to the model is that you need to treat those other disorders to help the people who have addictions. And you can easily lose sight of the things you need to do for the people with bipolar disorder or ADHD or trauma and so on if you're just focusing on the brain, because they usually just need a lot of sort of self-reconstruction and normal kinds of therapy and so on and so forth, and medication to treat the disorder. So, for example, in bipolar disorder, about 50% of bipolar people, maybe 60%, develop addictions in their lifetime. So that's an astronomically high incidence.
Wow. Yeah.
And other things. ADHD makes people more prone to addiction, and there's a lot of co-occurring depressions and anxieties, obviously. So it would be, if they had discovered that it's one brain system that was causing the problem, and you could develop a pill for that one brain system, that would have been useful. It just doesn't look like that's in the cards. And in fact, every current medication that helps addicts doesn't treat any underlying disease. It usually hits something like, it seems to help with cravings, which are usually a late development in any addiction. It doesn't help with getting rid of an underlying addiction. It just seems to mitigate craving, which of course is one of many clues to any addict to use. But other cues are out there, like our availability of drugs or other people using in your environment.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist, because we're all better with help. Visit BetterHelp.com/StopTheStigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.
You discussed go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you discussed the double bind of shame for addicts. How can society hold individuals accountable for their actions without deepening the stigma that may hinder recovery?
Right. Well, this is one where I think I don't have a full answer, but thank you for the question. I have some thoughts about it. So on the one hand, people, there's a kind of a glibness, and this is one reason why people love the disease model at one level. They'll say, oh, this is cool, because if addiction is a disease, then Owen isn't responsible. And I'm thinking to myself, well, no, just because even if you have a disorder, a psychiatric disorder, you're still responsible, and you might appropriately feel ashamed because, after all, you learned as a kid. We all learned as a kid. No one ever learned that you should want to be an addict, an alcoholic when you grow up. There was always a boundary, even if you're going to be, encouraged to be a heavy drinker or use whatever the local, available drugs are. No one aspired to be an addict. Now, once you violate those norms, it's quite natural and normal to feel a certain amount of shame and embarrassment. And partly that's because even you judge the condition you're now in as not a good thing for a human being to do, usually by the end. That's the addict's dilemma, of course, that it's stuck in this circle. Now, that produces shame, and a lot of people think, well, that shame is inappropriate. My thought is, no, that's kind of gaslighting to tell people that shame they're using is inappropriate. It's perfectly sensible to feel that shame because you're not living up to the standards that you want for your life. However, there is a double bind. The more shame you feel, the more you will want to mitigate the shame you feel. Bias, for example, I did when I'd wake up every day having failed the day before once again to not use and think I'm a pathetic, wretched human being. Now, what's the best way to get over that feeling? Well, the best way is to use again. And, by the end, when I was morning drinking, for example, I'd wake up feeling terrible, terrible shame. And my body, of course, was jonesing, needing alcohol again, because whatever was out of my system, my body was rebelling. So I needed the booze to mitigate these terrible physiological feelings, but it also worked to mitigate the shame. And that is a vicious cycle. So the overall idea that I have is that we just need to be not glib. This is very complicated. On the one hand,
sure,
addicts feeling shame, guilt, and responsibility for getting themselves out or being, in seeking help is just perfectly normal and sensible. Sure, in extreme ways, if people, if they themselves punish themselves, that will also be a contributing force. But that's just something that everybody dealing with this situation has to just be aware of. But it doesn't mean we should think that somehow addicts aren't responsible for getting, certainly in a forward-looking sense, addicts need to learn to respond differently in the future, and they have the ability to do so, although it's really, really hard. And you often need social support, therapy, treatment, drugs.
You describe addiction recovery as a social solution. What do you think needs to change in public policy or in treatment programs to better leverage that social aspect?
Yeah, good. So this has been sort of, an extraordinarily practically difficult thing. Well, some things on the sort of causal side. So we know, for example, some significant percentage of people do use drugs to self-medicate. So one thing you would need to watch out for on the sort of, developing addiction side is for society in general, educational institutions, families, churches, whatever, to be sensitive to helping people with pre-existing psychiatric or psychological disorders. That's expensive. How exactly you do that, that's for the psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, social workers to figure out. The other thing is we do know that an awful lot of addictions have origins not in treating psychiatric problems initially, but for social displacement. So the availability of drugs for poor people down on their luck who have nothing better to do than to take drugs, we know that that's a huge social problem. So clearly there are things we can do on that side by just normal social policy of decreasing poverty, helping with homelessness, et cetera, which of course is also partly caused by mental illnesses and addiction. So that's one area of social work. Some countries, like Portugal, did this. Portugal tried to use what we call harm reduction techniques, as did the state of Oregon. British Columbia uses these, Alberta, Canada, which roughly the idea is you do everything from these are where people have needle exchanges to try to prevent sort of, side effects like HIV, from shared needles, hepatitis, and so on and so forth. And not punishing people for possession of small amounts of drugs, but giving them sort of fines and then asking them to go to treatment. The problem so far in Portugal and in the U.S. in terms of the social policy is that sometimes, for example, in Oregon, it failed because two things happened. One is that drug cartels realized, they're not punishing people very much for using drugs anymore. Let's import more because the police are sort of hands off. And that, in fact, happened. The rate of addiction went up some after these, what you might think of as more liberal social policies came into effect.
And Oregon has now backed off that now because of that.
Totally backed off it. And one other dopey thing that they did was they said to people, you got to go to treatment. We're not going to punish you, but go to treatment. But guess what? They were 50th in the United States in the availability of treatment, and they didn't do anything to make. So basically, I say, Frank, you got to go into the treatment, but there is no treatment. So it's like, whatever a folie à deux for more than two parties. It was just, so some of that is the kind of social work. The other thing at the individual level is we often have to just accept that for particular individuals, the reasons that they've been using drugs and have found drugs useful in their life and the damage drugs have done are kind of idiosyncratic to them and usually have harmed their social relations. So just stopping the behavior of drinking when you learned it in a certain context, you get rid of the behavior, but you still have all the other sort of psychological and interpersonal issues you have. So we need to think holistically about what it needs to heal. I mean, you might heal in the sense you stop using, but you might not heal in terms of you have a job, that your social relations, your family relations are better, and these will make you continuously vulnerable going forward. So it's a big, big project, but it's much more than stopping a brain process and then having that stop a behavior.
All right, since you mentioned treatment, do you think that the treatment industry, which oftentimes does rely on the brain disease model rather than the disorder model which you've embraced, do you think that the treatment industry could adapt to embrace the more nuanced, holistic perspective that you present? And what would that look like?
Good. So it's an interesting question. You asked it exactly correctly. What would the sort of treatment, which is a huge both money making, and so the pharmaceutical industry definitely has this disease model. Even though the brain disease model dominates, it's actually 75% of treatment in the industry is actually based not really on a disease model, although they say officially it is. It's based on AA and NA principles, which is kind of interesting, which are not accepted. AA says that addiction is a disease. Technically, in Alcoholics Anonymous, they say it's an allergy. I always thought it was if it's a disease, it's the opposite of an allergy to me. I want all of it in me. I don't want to avoid it. So what's interesting about it, all the successful treatments, despite what anybody says about advertising that we treat the disease, are all based on, there are things like cognitive behavioral therapy. That's not brain-based at all. You just try to help a person identify the situations in which they use, the psychological, goods that they get out of it. And try to help people sort of figure out how to control their desires and beliefs in situations they're in. Then there's something called contingency management, where you give people small rewards, maybe for not using, give them a job, for example, for not using, and other therapeutic techniques like that. None of which actually use brain-based techniques. They're all kind of interpersonal, social, what we'd call psychotherapeutic kind of techniques. And what's interesting is the research is now in, and even programs like AA, which some people will say, well, that's not therapy. But then you might say, well, why does the industry is mostly 12-step based? Now, some people think that means the industry is very confused, which I agree with, because it says it's a disease, but it doesn't treat it as one. But I also think it shows that these interpersonal techniques of meeting in groups, having group therapy, being part of therapeutic communities, getting to the bottom of things with fellow addicts and also with professionals, helps people. The evidence is in that AA is about as good, works about as well as any formal treatment, psychotherapeutic treatment. And it works better at this point because there is nothing that people do. There are no effective, I shouldn't say there are no effective. There are some effective drug therapies, but as you know, like in the case of opioid addictions, they involve replacing one opioid with another, like methadone, for example, which has lower hedonic effects. It produces less vibrant pleasure and so on and so forth. I think the first pass thing would be for the treatment industry to recognize that it actually doesn't deploy a disease model. It just keeps advertising that there is this disease. And I think it's just, so it's already available internal to the way the addiction industry treats addiction, to see it as a more holistic disorder.
Let me end with this, Owen, and I hope you come back because I've enjoyed this very much, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole book. What are you hoping that readers, or listeners in this case, especially people who've not experienced addiction, what are you hoping they take away from your essay, your book, and this conversation?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Chris. So I guess I just hope one of the main emphasis of the book is that an awful lot of the focus of addicts is from what I call the objective point of view. It's the view of, people who correctly recognize that addicts cause terrible trouble. Once we get the kids addicted, if you start using drugs at 14 or 15, it's really bad. I mean, those are the biggest problems of addiction that's really treatment resistant. So we really have to be careful of the kids and so on. And so there's lots of objective social policy harms people do to family. But the point of view of the book is to say, now let me tell you a little bit, not only about myself, but from the subjective point of view of what it feels like to be an addict. And it feels different ways to different addicts. But I feel like it's important that sometimes addicts speak about why they're doing what they're doing, how it seems to them emotionally, what advantages and disadvantages they had from using. what kind of troubles it caused in their interpersonal relationships, that we see from our side. I mean, it's interesting because the society right now keeps wanting to say, a lot of people say, liberal, progressive people will say, oh, you shouldn't call addicts anymore, or, addicts, or alcoholics, because it's disrespectful. You should call them people with addictions. And that's just a lot of, that's sort of excessive, politically correct, immodest sort of, virtue signaling about yourself that you have an enlightened view. But if you hear from addicts, we're happy to call ourselves addicts. We do it in a loving way with ourselves. We try to do it in a compassionate way. But half the battle is recognizing that we have, you could call it a severe substance misuse problem. Sure, that's fine. But that takes too many words. We're comfortable with calling ourselves alcoholics or addicts. It's the beginning of healing for us. And to hear the voices of addicts themselves, I think, is crucial in developing sensible, public policy about how to deal with these problems.
Owen, thank you. Enjoyed the conversation very much. Congratulations on the new book. I hope people check it out. It's called What Is It Like to Be an Addict? Let's talk again.
Thank you so much, Frank. I'd love to do that.
Thank you, Owen Flanagan. If you want to be heard on this subject, you can give me a call, 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.